Soft morning light streamed through the glass windows of Seoul Diner, a tiny restaurant tucked between the narrow streets of Seoul. The gentle aroma of freshly cooked soup filled the air as Kim Yoon-ji carefully arranged side dishes on the counter. Her apron was slightly wrinkled, her steps slow but steady. At 8 months pregnant, even the simplest tasks had become heavier. Yet she carried them out with quiet grace. The first customers of the day came in, office workers, an elderly couple who always ordered the same stew. Yoon-ji greeted each one with a polite smile, her voice calm and warm. She moved around the tables with practiced care, always checking that every bowl was full, every guest felt noticed. Behind the counter, an old radio played softly. The sound of simmering pots and light chatter created a comforting rhythm that made the small diner feel alive. Yoon-ji placed a hand on her stomach for a brief moment and whispered to herself, "Just a few more weeks." Outside, the city was waking up, cars honking, the faint rumble of buses, the first drops of morning rain. The bell above the door jingled, announcing a new customer. Yoon-ji looked up, expecting another regular. Instead, a man in a grey suit stepped in. His shoulders were tense, his expression cold. He sat down heavily, dragging the chair across the floor. The warmth of the morning began to fade. The man in the grey suit sat impatiently, tapping his fingers against the table. His sharp eyes scanned the menu once before he called out, his voice cutting through the gentle hum of the diner. "Hey, is anyone even working here?" Yoon-ji hurried over with her usual polite smile, holding her order pad close to her chest. "I'm so sorry, sir. What would you like today?" He frowned, his tone growing harsher. "I've been sitting here for 5 minutes. You people don't care about your customers at all, do you?" The few people eating quietly looked up, startled. One of them shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then went back to his meal. Yoon-ji bowed slightly, trying to calm the tension. "I apologize, sir. I'll bring your food right away." When she placed the tray on his table a few minutes later, her hands trembled slightly. The man leaned forward, sniffed, and suddenly slammed his spoon down. "This is cold. Do you even know how to do your job?" His voice rose louder than before, echoing through the small diner. Yoon-ji froze. Her lips trembled, but she forced a small bow, whispering, "I'll fix it right away." He didn't stop. "Don't bother. People like you should stay home if you can't handle real work." The sound of his shouting filled every corner of the room. Customers stopped eating. The cook peeked through the kitchen window but said nothing. Yoon-ji stood still, one hand on her stomach, her eyes lowered, silently praying the moment would end. The diner fell completely silent. The only sound left was the steady hiss of food cooking in the kitchen. Every pair of eyes flicked toward the man, then away again, afraid to get involved. Yoon-ji stood frozen beside his table, her head slightly bowed. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible. The sting of humiliation burned behind her eyes, but she held her breath, trying not to cry. At the corner table, an older woman gripped her teacup tightly, whispering under her breath, "Poor girl." But she didn't move. A young man in a business suit looked down at his phone, pretending to type. No one wanted to make eye contact, afraid of the man's anger turning on them. The man shoved his plate forward, his voice rising again. "Do you think an apology fixes everything? You people are useless." The harsh clang of metal on porcelain echoed like thunder. Yoon-ji's hand instinctively moved to her belly. Her breathing quickened. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into silence. The cook opened the kitchen door halfway, eyes filled with worry, but before he could step out, the man's hand hit the table again, loud enough to make the cups tremble. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air was heavy, thick with fear and shame. Then, through the muffled quiet outside, the deep rumble of engines began to grow louder, the kind of sound that makes the ground almost vibrate. Heads turned toward the window. 4 motorcycles rolled to a stop in front of the diner, and that's when everything began to change. The diner's door creaked open, and a gust of cool air rushed inside. 4 bikers stepped in, their leather jackets glistening with raindrops, helmets tucked under their arms. The sound of their heavy boots against the wooden floor pulled every eye toward them. For a second, No one breathed. The shouting man glanced over his shoulder, frowning, his anger pausing mid-sentence. The customers stiffened, expecting trouble, their minds jumping to the worst possible conclusion. The leader, tall and calm, scanned the room. His gaze stopped on Yoonji, the trembling waitress standing near the man's table, one hand protectively resting on her belly. Something in her eyes must have said enough, because his expression changed from curiosity to quiet concern. Without a word, he motioned to his group, and they walked slowly toward her table. The tension grew thicker with every step. The man in the grey suit scoffed. "What now? You people want to eat too? There's no room here." Before he could finish, the biker leader stopped beside Yoonji. His voice was steady, low, and respectful. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The tone startled everyone. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply asked, as if the chaos around them didn't exist. Yoonji blinked, struggling to answer. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice trembled. The biker turned to the man, his calm gaze now sharp. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. The fear was no longer for Yoonji. It was for the man who had just realized he wasn't the loudest person in the room anymore. The biker leader took a slow step forward, his calm presence somehow louder than the man's shouting had been moments before. The grey-suited man leaned back slightly but tried to keep his pride. "What do you think you're doing?" the man snapped. "This is none of your business." The biker didn't flinch. "You made it everyone's business the moment you started yelling at her." His voice was steady, almost gentle, but there was strength behind every word. The man scoffed, glancing at the other bikers who now stood silently near the door, arms crossed. "What are you, her bodyguards?" he said, with a forced laugh. The leader's eyes didn't leave him. "No," he replied quietly, "just people who don't look away." The words hung in the air. The man's smirk faltered. The room, once tense with fear, now filled with something different: dignity, power, and calm justice. The biker leaned slightly closer. "You should leave before you say something you'll regret." For a moment, no one moved. The man's jaw tightened. Then he pushed his chair back sharply. "Fine," he muttered, avoiding everyone's eyes as he stood. He threw a few bills on the table and walked out without another word. The bell above the door jingled softly as it closed behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. A few others joined in. Within seconds, the small diner was filled with quiet applause. Yoonji covered her mouth, tears finally breaking free. She looked up at the biker, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He gave a small nod. "No one deserves to be spoken to like that." And with that, the balance of the room shifted completely, from fear to relief, from humiliation to respect. The tension in the diner slowly melted away, replaced by the soft hum of whispered relief. The customers, who had stayed silent moments earlier, now began to move. The older woman who'd been watching from the corner stood up and walked toward Yoonji, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly. "You were just doing your job." Yoonji nodded, unable to speak. Her cheeks were still wet with tears, but her breathing had steadied. The cook came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, guilt written across his face. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said quietly. The biker leader turned to him and shook his head. "What matters is that she's okay now." He spoke simply, without pride or drama, then looked back at Yoonji. "You handled that with more strength than you realize." Yoonji bowed her head slightly, whispering, "Thank you, all of you." One of the bikers reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small brown envelope on the counter. "This is for you," he said. "For your baby. Just take care of yourself." Yoonji hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, clutching it to her chest. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence carried warmth instead of fear. As the bikers turned to leave, their boots echoed softly against the floor. Just before the door closed behind them, Yoonji managed to say, "You changed my day, maybe even my life." The leader gave her one last nod, a faint smile on his face. "Sometimes," he said, "doing the right thing doesn't need a reason." The door shut. leaving behind the gentle ring of the bell and a diner full of people who would never forget what they'd just witnessed. The next morning, the rain had stopped and sunlight poured gently through the diner's front windows. The air felt lighter, calmer, as if the place itself had taken a deep breath overnight. Yunji stood behind the counter again, arranging the same side dishes as always. Yet something inside her had changed. Every movement felt steadier, every breath deeper. On the wall beside the cash register, she had pinned a small photograph that a customer had taken. The bikers standing outside their motorcycles, helmets in hand right after they left. She smiled quietly at the picture. Strangers, she thought, but somehow they felt like family for a moment. Throughout the day, people came in not just for food, but to ask if she was okay. Some offered kind words, others just a respectful nod. The older woman from yesterday left a single flower on the counter, and every time the bell above the door rang, Eunji looked up with a little more courage in her eyes. That evening, as she closed up, she looked out the window and whispered, "Maybe the world still has good people after all." Then, in a calm, emotional tone, the message fades in. Sometimes kindness doesn't shout. It just shows up when it's needed most. If you were there that day, would you have stepped forward or stayed silent? Share your answer in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't just scroll, leave a like, and help spread the reminder that compassion still exists. Because one simple act of courage can change someone's entire world.